Hey guys, tonight, we're stepping into one of the strangest jobs in history, a job where your entire purpose was simple: eat the king's food before he did. But there was one terrifying thought behind every meal. What if the food was poisoned? Imagine sitting at a royal table surrounded by gold, expensive dishes, and powerful people, but before the king could take a single bite, you had to taste everything first: the beautiful roasted meat, the expensive wine, the rare desserts. Every single dish. Your job was to discover danger before it reached the ruler, and if something went wrong, you would be the first person to find out. Royal food tasters lived in a world that looked luxurious from the outside. But behind the palace walls was a life filled with pressure, suspicion, and responsibility. They watched every meal carefully. They learned to recognize strange smells and unusual flavors. They lived among servants, cooks, guards, and nobles, all while knowing that one mistake could change everything. But their lives were not only about fear. Many food tasters enjoyed privileges that ordinary people could never imagine. They entered royal kitchens. They witnessed incredible feasts. They lived close to the center of power. Tonight, we'll follow the forgotten journey of these unusual palace workers, from the moment food arrived in the royal kitchen, to the final moment when a king or queen lifted their cup and began to eat. So get comfortable, relax, and let's travel back into the hidden world of royal courts to discover what it was really like to be a royal food taster. The morning begins long before the king opens his eyes. A pale ribbon of dawn slips over the palace walls, painting the ancient stone with soft shades of amber and gray. The courtyard is quiet except for the distant shuffle of servants carrying baskets of vegetables, bundles of herbs, and freshly baked loaves wrapped in linen. Somewhere nearby, a blacksmith's hammer rings gently through the cool air before fading into silence. From outside, the palace appears untouched by worry. Its towers rise proudly above the countryside, banners swaying lazily in the breeze. Travelers passing along the road imagine endless comfort behind those walls, tables overflowing with food, musicians filling the halls with cheerful melodies, and rulers living lives free from ordinary fears. Yet appearances have always been among history's greatest illusions. Inside these walls, trust is a rare treasure. Every visitor is watched, every letter is examined, every whispered conversation carries the possibility of hidden meaning, and nowhere is that quiet suspicion more present than where the royal meals are prepared. The kitchens awaken like a carefully rehearsed performance. Great fires roar beneath enormous iron cauldrons. Copper pots catch the first rays of sunlight. Cooks move with practiced confidence, slicing herbs gathered before sunrise, stirring fragrant broths, and roasting meats until their rich aroma fills every corner of the room. Fresh figs rest beside dark grapes. Honey glows inside polished jars. Rare spices, carried across deserts and distant seas, are measured with remarkable care, each tiny pinch worth more than many families could earn in months. Everything feels peaceful, everything appears perfect, but hidden beneath the comforting smells of bread and cinnamon lies a question no one dares ask aloud: is today's meal safe? It is easy to imagine poison as something dramatic, a dark liquid bubbling inside a sinister bottle. History was rarely so obvious. Some poisons had little taste, some blended quietly into wine, others disappeared beneath rich sauces or sweet desserts, leaving almost no trace until it was too late. For kings and queens, every feast carried a silent uncertainty. The greater the ruler's power, the greater the number of people who might wish to see that power come to an end. A battlefield was not always necessary. Sometimes an empire could change with a single sip. That possibility gave birth to one of history's most unusual responsibilities. Before the royal meal reached the table, someone else would taste it first, not because they hungered, not because they were honored guests, but because another person's life depended upon their willingness to accept uncertainty with quiet dignity. Imagine lifting a silver goblet toward your lips while dozens of watchful eyes remain fixed upon you. The room falls still, conversations pause, the king waits, the queen watches, the servants pretend not to stare. For several long moments, nothing happens. Only after time passes in peaceful silence does the ruler finally reach for the same cup. It is a simple act, one swallow, one quiet breath, yet within that ordinary moment rests the fragile confidence of an entire royal household. This was never merely a meal, it was a daily ritual built upon trust, patience, and invisible courage, performed by people whose names history almost forgot. And before you can truly understand the weight of that responsibility, you must first step beyond the grand dining hall and discover what it felt like to spend your very first day as the king's food taster. The palace feels different once the sun has fully risen. The quiet mystery of dawn has given way to gentle movement. Footsteps echo through long stone corridors. Linen curtains sway with the morning breeze, carrying the scent of fresh herbs from the gardens below. Somewhere in the distance, a fountain murmurs steadily, almost as if the palace itself is breathing. Yesterday, you stood outside this world, wondering what life behind these towering walls might be like. Today, you belong to it, not as a prince, not as a noble, but as someone entrusted with a responsibility that almost no one envies. Your first morning begins with no grand ceremony. There is no oath before the court, no applause, no jeweled medal placed around your neck. Instead, an older palace steward quietly leads you through a maze of hallways worn smooth by generations of servants. He walks with the confidence of a man who knows every hidden staircase and every door that remains closed to ordinary visitors. He speaks little. The palace has taught him that silence is often safer than conversation. Eventually, the corridors open into the royal kitchens once again. They are even larger than you remembered. Dozens of cooks move in perfect rhythm without raising their voices. One carefully trims fresh herbs gathered before sunrise. Another watches over simmering broth. Bakers slide golden loaves from enormous stone ovens while pastry makers gently decorate delicate honey cakes meant only for the royal table. Nobody appears rushed. Speed is less important than precision. Every ingredient is examined, every knife is cleaned, every serving dish polished until it reflects the firelight. You quickly discover that your work begins long before the king ever sits down to eat. A senior taster greets you with a quiet nod. His hair has already turned silver, though his posture remains straight. His face carries no sign of panic, only experience. He explains that tasting food is only one small part of the profession. Your eyes must notice what others overlook. Does the wine smell different today? Has the color of the soup changed? Why does one serving seem warmer than the others? Why has an unfamiliar servant entered the kitchen? Questions become habits. Habits become survival. As the morning continues, you begin learning names rather than titles. The baker who hums softly while kneading dough, the gardener whose hands always smell of rosemary, the elderly woman responsible for grinding expensive spices brought from lands you may never see, the young servant polishing silver cups until they shine like still water. Each person performs a small task. Together, they create a meal worthy of a king, and each of them understands that a single mistake could ripple through the entire palace. When the first meal is finally prepared, an unexpected silence settles across the kitchen. Conversation fades. Wooden spoons stop stirring. Even the crackling fire seems quieter. A simple wooden tray is placed before you. There is roasted fowl seasoned with fragrant herbs, fresh bread still warm from the oven, a bowl of thick vegetable stew, slices of ripe pear, and a silver cup filled with dark red wine. Nothing about the meal appears unusual. In fact, it looks wonderfully inviting. Perhaps that is what makes the moment so unsettling. Danger rarely announces itself. You are reminded not to rush. Take one bite, wait, take another, wait again. The pauses feel much longer than the eating itself. No one speaks while they watch, not because they expect disaster, but because patience has become part of the palace's rhythm. Minutes pass, your heartbeat gradually slows, nothing happens. Only then is the tray carefully carried away toward the royal dining chamber. You do not follow. Your place is not beside the throne. It is somewhere between the kitchens and the crown, existing quietly in a space that few people ever notice. As the days unfold, another realization begins to settle over you. The greatest burden of the job is not the possibility of poison, it is uncertainty. Every ordinary meal asks the same silent question: will today be as peaceful as yesterday? Most days, the answer is yes. That quiet success is never celebrated. No songs are written because nothing happened. No paintings are commissioned to honor another safe dinner. History remembers spectacular victories and dramatic betrayals. It rarely remembers the countless ordinary afternoons when careful people simply did their work well. And perhaps that is the truest measure of your new life. If you perform your duty perfectly, almost no one will ever speak your name. Yet every peaceful meal enjoyed by the ruler will carry a small, invisible piece of your courage, hidden behind every careful bite, every measured pause, and every quiet moment of trust. The palace never truly sleeps, even in the deepest hours of the night, when the corridors fall quiet and the great halls rest beneath the glow of dying candles. Someone is always awake. A guard changes his watch. A servant tends the kitchen fires. A messenger arrives through a side gate with news from a distant province. Somewhere beyond the thick stone walls, the kingdom continues to breathe. As you settle into your new life, you begin to notice something curious. The king fears many things, but not in the way ordinary people imagine. He does not spend every waking moment thinking about invading armies. He does not flinch at the sound of thunder. He does not tremble before the darkness. Instead, his greatest concern often arrives on the smallest of objects: a silver spoon, a crystal cup, a slice of bread. It seems almost impossible. How could a meal inspire more caution than a battlefield? The answer lies not in the food itself, but in the strange nature of power. A king could surround himself with towering walls, loyal soldiers, and the finest armor ever crafted. He could command thousands of warriors with a single word. Yet none of those things could protect him. Once he raised a cup to his lips, that single moment required trust, and trust was one of the rarest treasures inside a royal court. Every palace was filled with people whose lives depended upon the ruler. Some served faithfully for decades, others smiled politely while quietly dreaming of a different future. Not every conspiracy was born from hatred. Some grew from ambition, others from desperation, a disputed inheritance, a forgotten promise, an unpaid debt, a jealous rival hoping to gain influence. History has always been shaped by ordinary human emotions wearing expensive clothes. The palace itself reflects this quiet uncertainty. Magnificent marble halls echo with respectful greetings. Nobles bow gracefully before the throne. Musicians fill the air with gentle melodies during evening feasts. Everything appears harmonious, yet beneath that polished surface flows an invisible current of careful observation. Who whispered together for too long? Why has one advisor suddenly become unusually quiet? Why did an important guest decline the evening banquet? No accusation is spoken aloud, questions simply linger. You soon realize that suspicion has become another member of the royal household. It sits silently at every table, walks every corridor, listens to every conversation. Even the kitchens, filled with warm bread and fragrant herbs, are not untouched by its presence. Deliveries are checked, storage rooms remain locked, ingredients are counted before and after each meal, wine jars are sealed with wax, their markings carefully examined before being opened, not because everyone is believed to be guilty, but because certainty is impossible. Your own role begins to feel different as this understanding grows. You are no longer simply tasting food, you are becoming part of an invisible promise, a promise that says, "This meal has passed through careful hands." It is a quiet reassurance in a world where certainty can never be complete. There are stories whispered among older servants. Stories of rulers who trusted too easily. Stories of mysterious illnesses that appeared without warning. Stories that have changed slightly with each generation, until no one can be entirely certain where truth ends and legend begins. Perhaps that uncertainty is what gives the stories their power. Whether every tale happened exactly as remembered matters less than what people believed. Belief shapes behavior, fear shapes routine, and routine shapes history. Over time, you notice something almost comforting, despite all the caution. Most meals end peacefully. The king laughs with his guests, the queen shares fruit with visiting children, musicians continue playing soft melodies beneath candlelight, the palace carries on as though danger never existed. Perhaps that is the greatest success of everyone working behind the scenes. When every precaution is taken with patience and care, life appears wonderfully ordinary. No celebration follows a safe dinner. No bells ring because another meal ended without incident. The quiet victories remain invisible. As evening settles over the palace once more, the windows glow softly against the gathering darkness. Candles flicker in distant chambers. The scent of rosemary and fresh bread drifts through the cooling air. Beyond these walls, the kingdom sees only a palace filled with confidence and strength. Inside, countless unseen hands have worked together to preserve that image, because long before a crown could symbolize authority, it first depended upon something far simpler, the ability to share a meal, without fear becoming the final guest at the table. The royal dining hall often receives all the admiration. Visitors remember the towering columns, polished silver, embroidered tablecloths, and long tables covered with magnificent dishes. They speak of kings raising jeweled goblets beneath glittering chandeliers, of musicians filling the room with gentle melodies, and of nobles dressed in fabrics dyed with colors so rare they seemed almost magical. Few ever wonder how the meal arrived there. Long before the first candle is lit in the banquet hall, another world has already been awake for hours. It exists behind thick stone walls and heavy wooden doors, hidden from noble eyes. This is the kingdom behind the kingdom, the royal kitchens. As you become more familiar with your duties, you are permitted to wander places few outsiders ever see. Narrow corridors twist beneath the palace like quiet rivers, connecting storerooms, bakeries, wine cellars, smokehouses, and courtyards where fresh vegetables are sorted in woven baskets before sunrise. Every hallway carries its own scent: fresh bread, burning oak, rosemary, honey, warm butter, sometimes the sharp fragrance of onions being sliced by practiced hands. Sometimes the sweet perfume of crushed figs waiting to become desserts worthy of a royal table. The kitchens themselves seem almost like a small city. Huge brick ovens glow day and night, their warmth never completely fading. Massive copper kettles hang above slow-burning fires. Long wooden tables disappear beneath mountains of herbs, baskets of fruit, wheels of cheese, and carefully wrapped cuts of meat. Nothing feels chaotic. At first glance, it almost appears effortless, but the order comes from years of experience. Everyone knows exactly where they belong. The head cook rarely raises his voice. He doesn't need to. A simple glance is often enough. Young apprentices hurry to grind spices with heavy stone mortars. Experienced bakers shape delicate loaves with remarkable precision. Butchers prepare each cut with quiet confidence. Scullery servants endlessly wash bowls, knives, and polished platters until every surface gleams beneath the firelight. Each task may seem ordinary. Together, they become something extraordinary. You begin noticing details that guests in the dining hall never could. The bread arrives before dawn because the ovens require hours to heat properly. Fresh herbs are picked only moments before cooking so their fragrance remains strong. Wine is stored in cool underground chambers where thick stone walls protect it from the summer heat. Fish, when available, must be prepared almost immediately after arriving from nearby rivers or coastal ports. Every decision is guided by patience rather than speed. Some ingredients have traveled astonishing distances. Black pepper carried across deserts, cinnamon brought by merchants who crossed dangerous seas. Golden saffron carefully weighed like precious treasure. Each tiny pouch represents months of travel, countless negotiations, and journeys through lands the palace cooks may never see themselves. As a food taster, your understanding of meals changes forever. A roasted bird is no longer simply roasted bird. You notice the herbs tucked beneath its crisp skin, the careful balance of salt. The rich sauce simmered for hours until it reached the perfect texture. You begin to recognize the fingerprints of the cooks without ever seeing their hands touch the plate. The meal tells their story, yet despite all this skill, very few of these people will ever stand inside the royal banquet itself. When the food is finally arranged upon polished silver platters, servants lift each dish with remarkable care. They straighten their uniforms, take a slow breath, and begin the quiet walk toward the great hall. Their footsteps echo through familiar corridors. No applause greets them. The nobles waiting beyond those doors may never learn their names. If the meal is delicious, praise belongs to the ruler's magnificent household. If something goes wrong, the servants will remember it long after everyone else has forgotten. Watching them each day, you realize something unexpected. The palace does not run because of kings alone. It survives because hundreds of ordinary people perform extraordinary work without asking to be remembered. The cook who wakes before sunrise, the gardener tending herbs through cold mornings, the baker dusted in flour before dawn, the servant carrying heavy platters without spilling a single drop. Their hands shape every royal feast long before the crown ever reaches the table. As another meal quietly leaves the warmth of the kitchens and disappears into the splendor of the banquet hall, you find yourself looking less at the food and more at the unseen lives that carried it there. For behind every magnificent feast lies an invisible army of quiet dedication, hidden so completely that history almost forgot they were ever there at all. Morning arrives with familiar rhythms now. The palace no longer feels like an impossible maze. You recognize the gentle creak of the bakery door before sunrise, the soft scrape of wooden crates arriving from the gardens, and the comforting crackle of the kitchen fires that have burned in nearly the same place for generations. Every day begins quietly, every day begins the same, and yet, no two meals are ever truly identical. As a royal food taster, you soon discover that your work is far more careful than simply taking the first bite from every plate. The process begins long before the food reaches you. Trusted servants receive baskets of vegetables, fruits, and herbs from palace gardens or nearby farms. Fish are inspected while they are still fresh. Meat is examined before it ever touches the fire. Even barrels of wine are checked for broken seals or signs that they have been opened unexpectedly. Nothing is left entirely to chance. The palace cannot afford carelessness. Once the cooking begins, another quiet routine unfolds. The head cook oversees every stage of preparation, moving slowly through the kitchen with practiced confidence. Sauces are stirred gently over low flames. Bread is baked until its crust carries just the right shade of golden brown. Herbs are added carefully, never in haste, their fragrance filling the warm air with rosemary, thyme, sage, and mint. The kitchen smells comforting. Almost peaceful. It would be easy to forget why such care exists at all. Then the meal is assembled, each dish is placed upon polished silver or finely carved wooden platters. The portions intended for the ruler are arranged with remarkable precision. Every cup is filled. Every knife carefully positioned. Every cloth folded neatly beside the plate. Only then does your part begin. Contrary to popular stories, you are not expected to devour an entire banquet. Instead, you sample each item thoughtfully: a small piece of roasted meat, a spoonful of stew, a taste of fresh fruit, a sip of wine, enough to represent every dish without disturbing the meal itself. There is no rush. In fact, haste is discouraged. After each taste comes the hardest part: waiting. The room grows unusually still. The cooks return to quiet work, though their eyes occasionally drift toward you. A servant stand patiently with folded hands. The steward watches without speaking. Time itself seems to slow. 1 minute, then another, sometimes longer. This waiting is just as important as the tasting. Many substances feared throughout history did not act instantly. Palace households understood this, even if they could not explain it with modern science. Experience had taught them that patience often revealed what haste could not. As the minutes pass peacefully, conversation gradually returns. The kitchen breathes again. Someone laughs softly. A baker removes fresh loaves from the oven. A servant wipes flour from a wooden table. Life resumes its quiet rhythm. Only after enough time has passed are the dishes carried toward the royal dining chamber. Yet even then, your responsibility is not finished. You remain attentive. If the ruler asks for additional fruit, you taste it. A fresh goblet of wine, you sample that as well. A sweet pastry arriving late from the ovens, it receives the same careful attention. The duty follows the meal wherever it goes. Over time, your senses become surprisingly sharp. You notice when butter has been churned differently, when herbs are stronger after spring rains, when a wine from one vineyard tastes gentler than another, not because you are searching endlessly for danger, but because familiarity teaches you what is ordinary. And once you truly know the ordinary, even the smallest change becomes impossible to ignore. It is a quiet form of knowledge, built one meal at a time, one careful observation after another. Most days end without incident. The king enjoys his supper, the queen compliments the cook, guests admire the remarkable flavors brought from distant lands. No one applauds the invisible routine that made the meal feel safe. And perhaps that is exactly how everyone hopes it will remain, for the greatest success of a royal food taster is not surviving extraordinary danger, it is allowing an ordinary dinner to feel completely ordinary. As the candles burn lower and the final plates disappear from the banquet hall, you begin to understand that your work has never been about fear alone. It is about creating quiet confidence, one measured taste, one patient pause, and one peaceful meal after another, until caution itself becomes almost invisible, woven so naturally into palace life that those seated beneath the crown scarcely notice it at all. The palace changes once you stop noticing its beauty, not because the marble columns become less magnificent or the gardens lose their fragrance, but because your attention slowly drifts elsewhere. You begin listening instead of looking. You notice the rhythm of footsteps in the corridors, the tone of a servant's greeting, The brief hesitation before someone answers a simple question. Life has become a collection of small observations. That is what this profession quietly demands. Weeks have passed since your first meal, and nothing terrible has happened. The king continues to dine, the court continues to celebrate, the kitchens remain as busy as ever, to anyone watching from the outside. Your work would appear wonderfully uneventful, yet something inside you has begun to change. Every morning, before you taste the first dish, a single thought quietly returns. What if today is different? It is never a loud thought. It does not arrive with panic. It simply settles into your mind like the morning mist settling over the palace gardens. Always present, always waiting. You discover that fear is rarely dramatic. It is often quiet. Almost polite, it sits beside you without speaking, accompanying each meal like an invisible guest no one else acknowledges. At first, you try to ignore it. You remind yourself that countless meals have passed safely. The cooks are experienced. The servants are trustworthy. The procedures are careful. And most importantly, history is filled with ordinary days far more often than extraordinary ones. Still, the mind has its own habits. When you spend every day searching for the unusual, you begin noticing things that others overlook. A cup placed slightly farther from the plate than yesterday, a servant who seems unusually tired, a sauce with a richer aroma after fresh herbs arrived from the gardens. None of these changes mean danger, yet your thoughts naturally pause for a moment before moving on. You realize that constant awareness carries its own quiet burden. It follows you beyond the dining hall. Walking through the palace gardens no longer feels exactly the same. You notice which gates remain locked, which guards have changed their positions, which visitors have recently arrived. Even peaceful conversations between strangers occasionally catch your attention, not because you expect the worst, because your mind has learned to observe before it relaxes. The older food taster notices this before you do. One evening, after the final meal has been served, he joins you beneath a shaded courtyard where an ancient olive tree stretches its branches across the fading sky. For a while, neither of you speaks. The silence feels comfortable. Eventually, he smiles gently. The palace teaches everyone something, he says. It taught me that not every unanswered question deserves an answer. You consider those words for a long time. There is wisdom hidden inside them. A person cannot live peacefully while doubting every face they meet, nor can they perform this duty carelessly. Somewhere between suspicion and trust lies balance. Finding it may be the hardest lesson of all. As the seasons slowly change, your confidence grows, not because danger has disappeared, but because routine begins to steady your thoughts. The familiar sounds of chopping herbs, the warm scent of fresh bread, the quiet nod exchanged with the head cook each morning, these ordinary moments become small anchors, reminding you that the palace is built upon far more cooperation than conspiracy. You also begin noticing something unexpected. The king carries a burden of his own. Though surrounded by advisors, servants, and guards, he rarely eats without first waiting for your signal. For a few silent moments each day, even the most powerful person in the kingdom depends upon another human being. Power, you realize, does not erase uncertainty. Sometimes it magnifies it. That understanding changes the way you see the ruler. No longer as a distant figure seated beneath a golden canopy, but as another person quietly hoping that today's meal will end like yesterday's, peacefully. As evening settles across the palace, candles flicker behind tall windows, and laughter drifts softly from the banquet hall. The kingdom beyond the walls sees only confidence, ceremony, and royal splendor. Few could imagine the invisible weight carried by those who protect that image, not with swords, not with shields, but with patience, with careful observation, and with the quiet discipline of setting fear gently aside. just long enough to take another measured bite. There is a curious contradiction hidden within palace life. The more time you spend behind its towering walls, the more you understand that luxury and responsibility often walk side by side. To those outside, the palace is a place of endless comfort. Villagers imagine overflowing tables, warm fires that never fade, and rooms adorned with treasures gathered from every corner of the known world. They are not entirely wrong, but they do not see the price of living so close to the heart of power. By now, the faces around you have become familiar. The baker greets you with a quiet smile each morning. The kitchen steward nods as you pass. Even the palace guards recognize your footsteps in the corridors. Though you are not a noble, you no longer feel like a stranger. With your position comes privileges that few ordinary people could ever hope to enjoy. Your quarters are simple compared to the lavish apartments of dukes and royal advisors, yet they are remarkably comfortable. Thick stone walls keep the rooms cool during the summer and surprisingly warm through the winter. A sturdy wooden bed, layered with woolen blankets and a soft feather pillow, offers a level of comfort many people outside the palace have never known. A small table rests beside a narrow window overlooking the herb gardens. In the quiet hours before sunrise, the scent of lavender, thyme, and rosemary drifts gently through the open shutters. Birds gather among the cypress trees, their songs blending with the distant sound of the palace fountain. For a few peaceful moments each morning, it is easy to forget the purpose that brought you here. Your clothing, too, reflects your trusted position. Gone are the rough homespun garments worn by many laborers beyond the palace gates. Instead, you receive finely woven wool tunics, sturdy leather shoes, and heavy cloaks lined for the colder months. The fabrics are practical rather than extravagant, chosen for durability and dignity instead of display. You are expected to appear neat, dependable, and worthy of the king's confidence. The greatest luxury, however, is not what you wear, it is what you eat. Unlike most families in the kingdom, who often rely on coarse bread, porridge, and whatever the harvest allows, you are surrounded by remarkable abundance. Fresh bread emerges from the oven several times each day. Creamy cheeses are delivered from nearby estates. Sweet honey glistens inside polished ceramic bowls. There are crisp apples, ripe pears, figs bursting with sweetness, clusters of dark grapes, roasted fowl seasoned with fragrant herbs, delicate pastries, rich broths, and fish brought from rivers before the morning sun has climbed the sky. You do not feast like the king, but you eat far better than most people ever will. Over time, these comforts begin to feel ordinary, and that realization surprises you. The human heart adapts quickly. What once seemed extraordinary slowly becomes part of everyday life. You no longer pause to admire every marble hallway or every beautifully carved doorway. The magnificent tapestries hanging from the walls become familiar companions rather than astonishing works of art. Yet every now and then, something reminds you how unusual your life has become. Perhaps it is the arrival of merchants bearing spices from distant lands. Perhaps it is watching musicians rehearse quietly before a royal banquet. Or perhaps it is standing beside a window as the king's hunting party returns, banners fluttering gently in the afternoon breeze. These moments remind you that you are witnessing a world few people will ever see. Still, luxury cannot erase responsibility. The feather pillow does not silence anxious thoughts before an important feast. The warm cloak offers little comfort when uncertainty accompanies every meal. The finest bread in the kingdom tastes no different if your mind is occupied elsewhere. Gradually, you come to understand that privilege is never simply a gift. Inside the palace, every comfort exists because someone has earned the ruler's trust, and because that trust must be protected every single day. As evening settles across the royal gardens, Golden light spills through the palace windows, reflecting softly against polished stone. Laughter drifts from distant banquet halls, while servants quietly prepare tomorrow's tables with the same patient care as today. You stand for a moment beneath the fading sky, grateful for the comforts surrounding you, yet fully aware that they are only borrowed from the fragile world of royal favor. For in a palace where fortunes can change as quietly as the wind, even the greatest luxuries are sustained not by wealth alone, but by the confidence that tomorrow, once again, you will faithfully perform the duty entrusted to you. The palace is not built on stone alone, it is built on movement, on countless footsteps echoing through corridors at dawn, on hands that prepare, clean, carry, and repair without ever being asked for recognition, and on people who will never sit at the royal table, yet make every meal at that table possible. By now, you have begun to notice them more clearly, not just the cooks or the food tasters, but the wider world of servants who exist just beyond the attention of the court. They move like quiet shadows through the palace, always present, always working, rarely remembered. In the early morning hours, before sunlight fully reaches the courtyard, the palace already feels alive. Water carriers pass through narrow halls balancing heavy clay jars on their shoulders. Laundry workers disappear into stone-walled rooms filled with steam and the scent of soap and ash. Stable hands lead horses out into the cool air, brushing down their coats with steady patience. Each person has a task so specific, so repeated, that it becomes almost invisible over time, yet without them, nothing inside the palace would function. Even the most powerful throne in the kingdom depends on the smallest unseen effort. You begin to understand that service here is not a single profession, it is an entire ecosystem, a carefully balanced rhythm of lives working in quiet coordination. There are servants whose names are never spoken beyond the walls they clean, others who spend decades polishing the same bronze doors until their reflections become part of the metal itself. Some carry food, some carry water, some carry messages that determine the movements of entire courts, and yet, most of them will never witness the outcome of their work. A meal they prepare disappears behind the doors of the banquet hall. A letter they deliver changes a conversation they will never hear. A room they clean is filled moments later by people whose names they will never know. At first, this invisibility seems harsh, but over time, you begin to see another side to it. There is a strange dignity in work that exists without applause, a kind of quiet pride that does not depend on recognition. One afternoon, while walking through a lesser-used corridor, you notice an elderly servant carefully polishing a bronze railing. His movements are slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic. He does not look up as you pass, not out of disrespect, but because his attention belongs entirely to the task in front of him. When he finishes one section, he simply continues to the next, as though the work itself is enough. That moment stays with you longer than expected. Inside the grand halls, courtiers speak often of power, of influence, of proximity to the throne. But here, in these quieter spaces, power feels different. It is not loud or visible. It is steady, uninterrupted, carried in hands that never stop moving. Even the royal food you taste each day carries traces of this hidden world. The gardener who woke before sunrise to tend the herbs, the miller who ground grain into fine flour, the porter who carried heavy sacks across uneven stone paths, the kitchen servant who washed each bowl until no trace of yesterday remained. Each one contributes a small piece to something far greater than themselves, yet none of them will ever be mentioned in songs or written into royal chronicles. As days pass, you begin to realize that the palace is less like a monument to kingship and more like a living organism. Every corridor is a vein, every kitchen a beating heart, every servant a quiet pulse keeping everything alive. and the throne, so often imagined as the center of everything, is only possible because of this hidden structure beneath it. One evening, as candlelight spreads across the palace walls, you watch servants move through their final tasks of the day. Some extinguish torches along the corridors, others prepare linen for tomorrow. A few sit briefly in corners, resting their tired hands before rising again without complaint. There is no celebration when their work ends, no formal acknowledgement of effort, only the continuation of tomorrow, and yet, the palace does not fall silent. It continues, breathing softly through stone and shadow, sustained by those who will never be seen as its face, but who have always been its foundation. As you return to your quarters, a quiet thought lingers. Perhaps history does not forget these people because they were unimportant, but because their importance was so constant that it became invisible. And in a place built entirely on unseen effort, invisibility is not absence. It is structure. There is a certain silence that falls over the palace when rare ingredients arrive, not the ordinary silence of night, but something more attentive. As if the building itself recognizes that something unusual has entered its walls, you notice it first in the kitchens, a change in energy, a slight slowing of movement. Even the cooks, so confident in their daily rhythm, pause for just a moment longer than usual when they open the sealed crates. Inside are foods that feel almost unreal compared to the simple produce of nearby fields. Spices that have traveled across deserts where the wind buries entire roads, dried fruits from lands where the sun is said to burn differently, strange grains, dark and fragrant, packed carefully in woven bundles, and oils that shimmer faintly in clay jars, as though they still remember the distant places they came from. These ingredients are not everyday food, they are symbols of wealth, of reach, of power that extends far beyond the visible borders of the kingdom. The palace does not consume them often, but when it does, everything changes, even the air feels more deliberate. You learn that royal meals are not only about nourishment. They are about expression, a language without words. A roasted bird stuffed with rare spices is not just dinner. It is a statement of connection to distant lands. A dish sweetened with foreign honey is not just flavor. It is a reminder of trade routes stretching across continents. A bowl of fruit that cannot grow locally is not just luxury. It is proof that the kingdom can summon the world to its table, and so, every unusual ingredient carries meaning far beyond its taste. One morning, a caravan arrives at the palace gates. The guards allow it through slowly, inspecting every crate with practiced caution. Inside are goods collected over months of travel, spices wrapped in cloth, strange dried leaves, hard cheeses sealed in wax, and small jars of deep-colored liquids that catch the sunlight like polished stone. The cooks gather quietly to observe. Even the steward appears more alert than usual, not because they fear danger, but because rarity demands respect. In the kitchen, preparation becomes more careful than ever. Each ingredient is studied before it is used, not just for safety, but for understanding. What does it smell like when crushed? How does it change when heated? What memory does it leave on the tongue? You begin to realize that cooking here is not only craft, it is exploration. The food taster's role becomes slightly different on days like this. Not more dangerous, but more thoughtful. You are no longer just confirming safety, you are helping define experience. A small bite of an unfamiliar dish might reveal something entirely new about texture or balance or heat, something the cooks themselves are still learning to understand. One afternoon, you are given a dish unlike anything you have seen before. It arrives in a shallow bronze bowl. Inside is a slow-cooked mixture of grain, herbs, and a dark sauce that carries a scent. Both earthy and slightly sweet, the aroma is unfamiliar, not unpleasant, just distant. Like a memory you cannot place, you take a careful taste, the flavor unfolds slowly, first warmth, then a subtle bitterness, then something unexpectedly smooth beneath it all. Around you, the kitchen remains silent, not tense, just attentive, waiting to understand what this new thing has become. Moments pass, nothing happens, only the quiet realization that even the most foreign flavors can become part of daily life once they are understood. Over time, you notice a pattern. The palace does not collect strange foods for novelty alone, it collects them to expand its world. Every new spice is a new conversation, every unfamiliar dish is a small bridge between distant lands and the royal table. And somewhere within this quiet exchange of flavors and cultures, you begin to see something deeper. The palace is not only consuming the world, it is being shaped by it. As evening approaches, the kitchens return to their usual rhythm, the rare ingredients are stored away, the fires are lowered, and the scent of familiar bread and herbs slowly returns to the air. But something lingers, a subtle reminder that beyond the walls, the world is far larger, more varied, and more connected. Then it appears from the throne, and inside the palace, even the simplest meal carries the echo of distant places. Waiting quietly to be tasted, one careful bite at a time. There are days in the palace that feel almost identical to the others, the same corridors, the same morning light slipping through arched windows, the same quiet rhythm of servants moving between kitchens, storerooms, and dining halls, and yet, sometimes, without warning, something interrupts that rhythm in a way no one forgets. It does not arrive with noise, it arrives with silence, a pause where there should not be one. You first notice it one afternoon in the kitchens. The air feels unchanged at first, bread still rises in warm ovens, broth still simmer gently over low flames, cooks still move with practiced precision, but then, a single voice cuts through the calm. Not loud, not dramatic, just firm enough to make every movement stop. A steward stands near the preparation table, holding a small silver cup. His eyes do not leave it. Inside is wine meant for the royal table, and something about it does not feel right. No one speaks for a moment. Even the fire seems quieter. This is one of those rare points in palace life where routine breaks apart into uncertainty. The cup is examined, not by one person, but by several. A cook leans closer. A servant steps back instinctively. You are called forward, though nothing about the situation has been confirmed. This is how danger often exists here, not a certainty, but a suspicion. You observe carefully. The wine looks normal, its color is deep and steady, its surface still, but experience teaches something important. Not all danger announces itself, some possibilities exist only in hesitation. The decision is made to proceed cautiously. A small portion is set aside for tasting, not enough to disturb the meal. Just enough to understand whether concern is justified. The room waits. Again, waiting is never empty here. It is filled with observation. Breathing becomes quieter, movements become smaller, even the clinking of utensils fades. You take the taste, carefully, slowly. The flavor is ordinary, rich, familiar, no immediate reaction follows, but still, protocol requires patience. Time must pass before certainty can return, so you wait, and in that waiting, you begin to understand something deeper about your role. The danger is rarely visible, the fear is rarely proven. Most of the time, what you are truly testing is not just food, but doubt itself. Eventually, nothing changes, the wine is declared safe. The tension dissolves slowly, like mist. Lifting from stone, conversation returns in soft fragments. Work resumes, the kitchen breathes again, yet something remains behind, a memory of stillness, a reminder of how quickly ordinary life can become uncertain. Later, you hear stories from older servants. They do not speak of poison as something frequent. Instead, they speak of moments, small, sharp moments where everything slows, a spoon dropped too quietly, a servant arriving a step too late, a dish left untouched for longer than expected. Sometimes, it is not the substance that causes fear, it is timing and interpretation. You begin to realize that the most dangerous part of your role is not the tasting itself, it is the responsibility of being the point where uncertainty must become decision. That responsibility grows heavier when you consider what it protects. A king does not eat alone. Every meal is shared with advisors, guests, envoys, and family. One mistake does not affect a single life, it echoes through many. This thought never feels dramatic, it feels quiet, like a weight that settles into understanding rather than fear. There are also moments that never become official incidents, yet stay in memory. A dish once sent back because it tasted slightly different than expected, a broth reheated after a servant noticed an unfamiliar scent, a fruit basket replaced entirely after small inconsistencies were observed in its arrangement. No one outside the kitchens ever hears about these moments. They disappear into silence, like ripples fading on water, but inside the palace, they shape habits. Over time, you learn that safety here is not a single act, it is a continuous attention, a shared responsibility between many hands. As evening arrives, the palace returns once again to its composed rhythm. Candles glow in long corridors, music drifts softly from distant halls, the king dines without interruption. And the world beyond the walls continues to imagine perfection. Across history, fear has a way of shaping memory more strongly than peace ever could. It lingers in stories, in whispers passed through generations, in carefully recorded accounts that mix truth with caution, and caution with imagination. And nowhere is this more visible than in the lives of rulers who lived with an almost constant awareness that what they ate might one day decide everything. Inside the palace, you begin to notice how often older servants speak in fragments of stories rather than complete explanations. A king who refused to eat fruit unless it was peeled in front of him, a queen who only drank from a cup she kept locked beside her bed, a ruler who insisted on watching every ingredient enter the kitchen personally. As if observation alone could guarantee safety, whether every detail is perfectly accurate no longer matters. What matters is what these stories reveal, a world where trust was always fragile, and suspicion was always nearby. One of the most repeated tales involves rulers who surrounded themselves with layers of protection not just in war, but in dining halls. Food would pass through multiple hands before reaching the royal table. Gardeners, cooks, servants, stewards, and finally the taster. Each step was a barrier. Each barrier a quiet attempt to reduce uncertainty. Yet even with all these precautions, fear never fully disappeared. It only changed shape. You hear of rulers who developed strange habits over time. Some avoided meals prepared outside their own kitchens entirely. Others demanded that every dish be prepared in visible view, as though seeing the process could eliminate hidden risks. There were even those who kept personal animals, birds or small creatures, that would be fed first, a practice born from the belief that nature might reveal danger before humans could. Whether such practices were truly effective or simply comforting is something history rarely answers clearly. But what is clear is the emotional reality behind them. Power does not remove vulnerability, it often amplifies it. The higher a person rises, the fewer people remain between them and consequence, and food, something so ordinary for most, becomes something deeply symbolic for those at the top. A meal is no longer just nourishment, it becomes a moment of exposure, a brief pause where everything depends on trust. As a food taster, you begin to understand that these fears were not always irrational. Courts were places of ambition, and ambition often carries quiet tension beneath polite conversation, a promotion denied, a favor lost, a rivalry that never fully disappears. History is filled with such human emotions, and palaces concentrate them into smaller, more intense spaces. This is why stories of poison fear survived so strongly. They reflect not just danger, but doubt, and doubt is something every human recognizes. One evening, an older servant tells you a story while walking through a dim corridor lined with faded tapestries. He speaks of a banquet where a ruler refused to eat until every dish had been sampled twice. Not because anything was found wrong, but because reassurance itself had become part of the ritual. By the end of the meal, nothing unusual had occurred, yet the entire court had remained tense, simply because expectation had shifted from enjoyment to caution. That, he says quietly, is how fear grows without anyone noticing, not through disaster, but through repetition. Over time, even harmless routines can begin to carry emotional weight. A pause before eating, a glance toward the taster, a moment of silence before a cup is lifted. None of these actions are dramatic on their own, but together, they form a pattern that reshapes how meals are experienced. Still, most royal dinners end in ordinary peace. Laughter returns, music resumes, dishes are cleared without incident, and life continues in its familiar rhythm, as if uncertainty had never entered the room at all. Perhaps that is why these stories survived so vividly, because they exist between extremes, between fear and normality, between imagination and routine. As night settles over the palace, you realize something subtle but important. The fear of poison was never just about food, it was about control, about the invisible desire to ensure that even the most basic act of living, eating, remained untouched by chaos. And in that quiet understanding, the stories of old rulers and their unusual precautions begin to feel less like distant legends, and more like reflections of a very human need to feel safe, even in a world that never fully guarantees it. By now, the palace feels less like a place of mystery, and more like a place of patterns. You start recognizing how stories grow here, how small truths become larger over time, and how imagination quietly fills the gaps where memory is uncertain. This is especially true when it comes to the role you now live every day, the royal food taster. Outside these walls, the image is almost always the same: a tense figure standing beside a golden table, a dramatic moment of hesitation, a sudden collapse after a single bite, a kingdom held in suspense by one dangerous meal. But inside the palace, reality is far quieter and far more ordinary. You begin to understand that much of what people believe about your role is shaped not by lived experience, but by stories that were told and retold until they became sharper than the truth itself. In those stories, poison is always immediate, always visible, always dramatic, but in real life, uncertainty rarely behaves that way. Most meals pass without incident, most days end in silence rather than catastrophe. The work is not defined by dramatic moments, it is defined by repetition, careful, patient repetition. There is no single grand ritual that transforms food into safety. There is only a system of small, consistent actions performed by many people who rarely appear in the same story together. You begin to notice how different this feels from the way it is often described in traveling tales or court gossip. In those versions, the food taster is alone, isolated, carrying the entire weight of royal safety on a single decision, but the truth is more distributed. Responsibility is shared across kitchens, storage rooms, gardens, and servants moving quietly through the palace at all hours. You are one part of a much larger process, not its center. One afternoon, while passing through a quiet corridor, you overhear a visiting scholar speaking with a court storyteller. They are discussing ancient rulers and their supposed fears. The storyteller describes elaborate precautions, hidden cups, secret testers, instant consequences tied to every meal. The scholar listens patiently, then gently corrects him. He explains that while rulers certainly feared uncertainty, the systems they built were usually practical rather than theatrical: careful inspection, trusted preparation, repetition of safe routines, not the dramatic scenes often imagined by those far removed from palace life. You continue walking, but the conversation lingers in your mind. It becomes clear that history often prefers striking images over subtle truths. A collapsing figure is easier to remember than a quiet meal that ended safely. A moment of panic is more memorable than 1,000 uneventful afternoons. Even you, living within this world, sometimes feel the pull of those exaggerated images. There are moments when silence in the kitchen feels heavier than it truly is. Moments when a paused conversation seems more meaningful than it actually becomes. But experience slowly teaches you to distinguish between perception and reality. Most of what feels intense in the moment fades quickly when nothing follows it. This is perhaps the most important difference you learn. Not everything significant announces itself dramatically. In fact, most important things do not. They simply continue steadily, without interruption. Over time, you also notice how stories outside the palace shape expectations inside it. New servants sometimes arrive expecting tension at every meal. They imagine constant danger, constant vigilance, constant fear. But after a few weeks, those expectations soften, not because the responsibility disappears, but because the rhythm of daily life proves more stable than rumor suggests. The kitchens remain warm and active. The meals continue to be prepared with care, and most days pass without any reason for alarm. Even so, caution does not vanish. It simply becomes quieter, less theatrical, more integrated into habit than emotion. One evening, an older steward speaks to you while the palace settles into night. He says something simple: if danger were constant, we would never survive here. It is not said as philosophy, just observation, and yet it stays with you, because it reframes everything you have experienced. The role is not about living in fear, it is about maintaining order in a place where many people depend on that order remaining intact. As candlelight spreads through the corridors and the final sounds of the kitchen fade into silence, you think again about the difference between myth and reality. Myth prefers sharp edges, reality prefers continuity. Myth demands moments, reality is made of days, and somewhere between those two versions of the world, your life continues. Steady, ordinary, and quietly essential in ways that stories often struggle to capture. The royal kitchen is never truly silent. Even in the calmest hours, when meals have already been served and the fires have been lowered, there is always something moving in the background: a pot being washed, a cloth folded, a knife placed carefully back into its resting place. It is a place that never fully rests, because the palace itself never fully rests. But as you spend more time here, you begin to realize something subtle. The kitchen is not just where food is made, it is where information quietly travels, not spoken loudly, not recorded officially, but exchanged in passing moments that most people would never notice: a glance between two servants, a whispered instruction near a storage shelf, a pause in conversation when someone unfamiliar enters the room. These are not secrets in the dramatic sense. They are fragments of awareness, the kind that exist only in places where many lives intersect every single day. At the center of it all are the cooks. They are not just workers, they are guardians of consistency. Each dish must match expectation. each flavor must remain familiar enough to be trusted. A small mistake in seasoning is not just a culinary error, it becomes a question in the minds of those who serve the royal table. Why does it taste different today? Was it the herbs? Was it the supplier? Was it simply human variation? These questions are rarely spoken aloud, but they linger in thought. Around them move the servants, carrying baskets of ingredients, washing bowls until they shine under soft light, transporting trays through corridors that twist deep into the palace structure. They know the rhythm of the kitchen better than any written schedule. They feel when something changes, even slightly. And then there are the guards, not always visible, but always present in the background of important spaces. They do not interfere with cooking, they do not taste the food, but their presence shapes behavior. A reminder that the kitchen is not separate from power, it is part of it. You begin to notice how carefully information is controlled in such a place, not through force, but through awareness. Certain conversations stop when unfamiliar ears are nearby. Certain instructions are repeated only in trusted circles. Even rumors move carefully here, as if the walls themselves might remember them. One afternoon, while moving between preparation rooms, you overhear a quiet discussion between two senior cooks. They are not speaking about danger, they are speaking about trust, a supplier who has changed, a shipment that arrived later than expected, a herb that looks slightly different than before. Nothing alarming on its own, but in the kitchen, nothing is ever truly isolated. Everything connects to something else. A change in one ingredient can ripple through multiple dishes, and those dishes will eventually reach the royal table. So every detail matters, not with panic, but with attention. You begin to understand that the kitchen operates on a kind of shared memory. People remember how things are supposed to look, smell, and feel, and when something shifts, even slightly, it is noticed collectively before it becomes a problem. This is how stability is maintained, not through strict control alone, but through countless small observations made by people who care enough to notice what others might overlook. One evening, as the day's final preparations come to an end, the kitchen feels different, not busy, not tense. Just complete, like a system. Settling into balance after hours of motion, the fires glow low and steady, the tables are cleared, the last dishes are covered and carried away. For a moment, you stand near the entrance and watch. Cooks exchanging quiet words, servants moving with familiar ease, guards stationed at their usual positions, unmoving but present, and you realize something simple but important. The kitchen is not just a place of labor, it is a place of coordination, a space where many unseen understandings come together without ever needing to be spoken directly. Outside, the palace continues its evening rhythm. Music faintly echoes from distant halls, candles flicker along corridors, and the royal household prepares for another night of calm ceremony. But here, in the heart of preparation, you see the truth more clearly. Every meal that reaches the royal table carries with it more than flavor. It carries trust, built slowly, maintained quietly, and protected not by a single person, but by an entire world of careful eyes, steady hands, and unspoken understanding working together in silence. There is a question that no one in the palace asks directly, not because it is forbidden, but because it is uncomfortable. It lingers in the background of the work, like a thought everyone understands but chooses not to shape into words. What happens when the person who tastes the food becomes unwell? You begin to sense the weight of this question only after enough time has passed inside the kitchens, after enough meals have been tested, after enough quiet routines have become familiar. At first, the role of a food taster feels like a clear boundary. You taste, you wait, you observe, and then the meal continues. But life inside the palace rarely remained so simple. One morning, the usual rhythm of preparation is slightly interrupted, not dramatically, not loudly, just enough to feel different. The food taster who worked before you does not arrive at his usual time. At first, no one speaks about it. The kitchens continue as normal, because they must. Bread still needs to be baked. Broth still needs to be prepared. The royal table still depends on routine, regardless of uncertainty. But in the background, awareness shifts. Servants glance toward the entrance. More often than usual, a steward pauses longer than necessary while reviewing the day's dishes. Even the cooks seem quieter in their movements, as if trying not to disturb an invisible question hanging in the air. Eventually, word passes quietly through trusted channels. The previous taster has fallen ill. There are no details given at first, only confirmation, and in the palace, confirmation without detail often creates more reflection than explanation. You are not told what caused it, and perhaps no one truly knows. Illness, after all, is not always connected to danger, but in your position, certainty is never immediate, only possibility. The meals of the day continue. But something subtle has changed. Every dish is approached with slightly more attention. Every ingredient feels a little more observed than before, not out of panic, but out of awareness. You begin to understand how fragile trust can feel when it is tied to something so simple as eating. The palace does not stop. It cannot. The royal household depends on continuity, so the system adjusts quietly. A replacement is considered. Additional checks are suggested. Procedures are followed more carefully than before, all without ever naming fear directly. One afternoon, you find yourself standing in a quiet corridor near the kitchens. An older servant passes by and pauses for a moment. He looks at you, not with alarm, but with something closer to understanding. Then he speaks softly. This happens sometimes, he says, not as a warning, but as a fact of life. There is no drama in his voice, only experience, and that makes it more unsettling in its own way. Because it reminds you that uncertainty is not rare here, it is simply managed, not eliminated. As days pass, the absent taster's absence becomes part of the routine. Work continues, meals are prepared, the royal table remains unchanged in appearance. But beneath the surface, awareness has shifted permanently. You begin to notice how quickly the palace adapts to silence, how easily one person's absence becomes absorbed into structure. There is no ceremony for uncertainty, no moment of reflection built into the system, only continuation. Still, you cannot ignore what has been revealed. The role you occupy is not just about tasting food. It is about stepping into a space where consequences are not always immediate, and causes are not always clear, a space where even ordinary illness can feel heavier than it should. One evening, after the kitchens have quieted, you remain behind longer than usual. The fires are low. The air is still warm with the scent of herbs and baked bread. Everything looks normal again, but normal no longer feels entirely simple. You realize something slowly, without it being spoken aloud. The palace depends not only on certainty, but on the willingness to continue despite uncertainty, and those who serve closest to the royal table carry that truth most directly, not as fear, but as quiet responsibility. As you finally step away from the kitchen, the corridor ahead feels familiar again, yet something has changed, not in the palace itself, but in how you now understand what it means to stand between routine and risk. In a world where even the smallest absence can echo longer than anyone wishes to admit, there is a kind of history that is written in gold, names of kings, dates of battles, stories of triumphs and defeats that shaped entire kingdoms. But there is another kind of history, one that rarely appears in records or songs. It is written in footsteps across stone floors, in worn hands that never appear in portraits, in quiet routines that repeat so often they begin to disappear from memory. Inside the palace, you begin to see this second history more clearly, not through grand events, but through the people who keep everything functioning without ever being seen as central to it. Each morning begins before the sun fully rises. The palace stirs slowly, like a living thing waking from deep sleep. Servants are already moving by the time the first light reaches the courtyards. Some carry water through narrow corridors, balancing heavy clay vessels with practiced precision. Others sweep stone floors, brushing away the dust that collects overnight as if the palace itself breathes and sheds it. In the kitchens, fire is already alive, not roaring, just steady, waiting for the day's work to begin. You notice how little recognition exists for these tasks. There are no announcements for their completion, no formal acknowledgement when everything is done correctly, and yet, if even one of these tasks is delayed, the entire rhythm of palace life begins to shift. A delayed delivery of water affects cooking. A missing basket of herbs changes preparation. A forgotten cloth in a banquet hall becomes a visible flaw in a place where perfection is expected, and still, the people who perform these tasks remain largely unnamed. You begin to learn small details about them over time. A young servant who wakes earlier than anyone else because he prefers quiet corridors. An older woman who has worked in the same laundry rooms for decades, knowing every stain removal method passed down informally between generations. A porter who can carry loads that seem impossible, yet moves with patience rather than haste. None of them speak of ambition, not because they lack dreams, but because life inside the palace teaches a different kind of focus. Here, usefulness often matters more than visibility. One afternoon, you find yourself walking through a long service corridor rarely used by nobles. The light is dimmer here, the walls are simpler, and the sounds of the palace feel more distant. You see servants resting briefly between tasks, sitting on stone steps with quiet exhaustion in their posture. There is no complaint in their silence, only recovery. One of them nods as you pass, not formally, just as recognition between people who share the same space, even if not the same role. In that moment, something shifts in your understanding. These lives are not small, they are simply unseen from the center of attention. Later, in the kitchens, you observe how knowledge is passed without instruction. A cook shows a younger servant how to judge heat by sound instead of sight. A baker adjusts another's technique with a gentle correction rather than explanation. A steward remembers exactly how long a broth should rest before being served, not because it is written anywhere, but because he has done it 1,000 times before. This kind of knowledge does not live in books. It lives in repetition and memory, and attention to detail that no one formally records. As the day progresses, the palace becomes fuller with movement again, but you begin to notice something else. There is a kind of stability here that depends entirely on people who will never be celebrated for maintaining it. Their work is not extraordinary in a visible way, but it is constant, and constancy, you realize, is what allows everything else to appear effortless. Even the royal table, with all its elegance and precision, is only possible because of countless unseen actions that begin hours before anyone sits down. As evening approaches, the light softens across the palace walls. Servants continue moving, though more slowly now. The energy shifts from preparation to completion. Tasks are finished. Spaces are restored. Tools are cleaned and placed back where they belong. There is no ceremony to mark the end of the day, only the gradual settling of quiet. You stand for a moment in the courtyard, watching the final movements of people who will never be recorded in official histories, and you understand something simple. but lasting. A kingdom is not only shaped by those who rule it, it is shaped just as deeply by those who maintain it without ever being named. As night begins to settle over the palace, the unseen history continues, not in records or monuments, but in the steady rhythm of ordinary lives that hold everything together without ever asking to be remembered. Inside the palace, nothing is ever just what it appears to be. A meal is never only a meal, a table is never only a place to eat, and a gathering is never only about hunger or celebration. Over time, you begin to notice how food quietly carries meaning beyond flavor. It becomes a language of power, not spoken aloud, but understood by everyone present. In the royal court, every detail of a meal is intentional. The number of dishes, the order in which they arrive, the richness of the ingredients, even the spacing between plates on the table, none of it is accidental. When a ruler hosts a banquet, it is not simply hospitality, it is communication. To guests, it says something about stability, about abundance, about control over land, trade, and resources. A table filled with rare spices, imported fruits, and carefully prepared meats is not just impressive, it is a quiet demonstration of reach, a reminder that distant regions contribute to this moment without ever being present in it. You start to see how carefully these messages are constructed. Merchants are invited not only for trade, but for visibility. Foreign envoys are seated according to subtle hierarchies that reflect political importance. Even the simplicity or complexity of a dish can carry meaning. A plain meal can signal restraint, a lavish spread can signal dominance. Nothing is neutral. One afternoon, you observe a banquet being prepared for visiting nobles. The kitchen is more active than usual, but not chaotic. It moves like a well-rehearsed performance. Every station knows its role. Every dish has its timing. The cooks are not just preparing food, they are preparing influence. As the meal comes together, you notice how carefully the steward oversees each stage. A dish is delayed slightly, another is adjusted at the last moment, not for taste alone, but for presentation, because in the royal court, presentation is part of persuasion. When the guests finally arrive, the transformation is immediate. The same palace corridors that felt familiar in the morning now feel different, more formal, more measured. Voices lower slightly, movements become more deliberate, even laughter seems controlled, as if aware of its audience. At the table, every gesture is observed. Who is served first? Who receives which portion? Who is offered wine before others? These choices form a silent hierarchy that everyone understands without needing explanation. You realize that politics here does not only happen in councils or private chambers. It happens in every shared meal. A favor can be expressed through an extra dish, a subtle insult can be delivered by delay or omission. Even seating arrangements carry meaning that no written decree could fully capture. As the banquet progresses, you stand quietly at the edge of the room, observing. Your role remains the same, to ensure safety, to observe before others consume, but now you see that your presence also carries another layer. A reminder that control extends even into the most ordinary act of eating, and that control itself is part of power. Later, after the guests have departed, the kitchen becomes quieter again. Servants begin clearing dishes, cooks wipe down surfaces. The glow of celebration fades into routine once more, but the impression of the evening remains, not in the food, but in what the food represented. You begin to understand that the palace does not separate nourishment from authority, it blends them, carefully, continuously, so that every meal becomes both sustenance and message. As night settles over the corridors, you think back on the banquet. Not for its flavors, but for its structure, for the invisible rules shaping every moment of it, and you realize something subtle but important. In the royal court, power is not only held through commands or laws, It is also served, one dish at a time, in silence, until even the act of eating becomes part of the language of rule itself. In the palace, even silence has structure. There are moments when you realize that nothing here happens without form, not because it is forced, but because repetition has turned it into tradition. Nowhere is this more visible than at the royal table. What appears, from a distance, to be a simple act of eating is in reality a carefully arranged sequence of behaviors, gestures, and pauses that everyone understands without needing instruction. You begin to notice the rules slowly, not all at once, but through observation, through small corrections, through moments when someone pauses slightly longer than expected, and is gently reminded, without words, that timing matters here. Before a meal even begins, there is preparation beyond the food itself. The room must be arranged in a specific order. Seating is not random, it reflects rank, trust, and presence within the court. Even the direction a chair faces carries meaning that most visitors would never consciously notice, but instinctively feel. When the ruler enters the hall, conversation lowers naturally, not out of fear alone, but out of rhythm. As if the entire room remembers its place at once. The first dishes are never the most elaborate, they arrive carefully, in stages, each one timed to maintain balance in the flow of the meal. Nothing is rushed, nothing is accidental. Even the way servants walk between tables follows an unspoken choreography. Measured steps, controlled movements, no unnecessary sound. You start to understand that in this environment, elegance is not decoration, it is discipline made visible. There are rules for speaking as well. Certain topics belong only to certain moments. Some conversations are allowed only after specific courses have been served. Others are reserved for quieter intervals, when the meal has temporarily slowed and attention is less divided. Even laughter has its place. Too early, and it feels out of rhythm. Too late, and it feels disconnected from the moment. These details are never written down for most people. They are learned through presence, through watching others, through correction that is rarely direct. One afternoon, you observe a visiting noble who is unfamiliar with court customs. He speaks too freely. At the beginning of the meal, he gestures more than others. At first, nothing is said, but gradually, you notice subtle shifts around him. Responses become shorter, pauses grow longer. The flow of conversation gently adjusts itself until he unconsciously follows the rhythm of the room. No one instructs him. The palace itself corrects him, not through force, but through structure. Even utensils carry their own expectations, how they are held, when they are placed down, how long they may rest between uses before it is considered a pause in the meal rather than hesitation. You realize that here, dining is not just consumption. It is participation in a shared system of order. As a food taster, your role fits into this structure in a way that is both visible and invisible. You are acknowledged, but not centered, present, but not disruptive. You observe before others proceed. Yet you do not interrupt the flow of the meal itself. It is a balance that must be maintained carefully. Over time, you begin to see how deeply these rules shape behavior even outside the dining hall. Servants carry similar discipline into their daily tasks. Cooks prepare dishes with timing in mind that extends beyond flavor. Even conversations in corridors sometimes mirror the rhythm of formal meals, with pauses that feel almost rehearsed. It is not rigidity, it is continuity, a shared understanding that allows hundreds of people to move through the same space without confusion. As evening arrives, the royal dining hall returns to stillness. Tables are cleared, fires are lowered. Candles dim one by one, leaving behind the faint memory of order that once filled the room. You stand for a moment at the edge of the hall, observing the empty space, and you realize something simple. Yet important, the rules you have been witnessing are not only about control, they are about stability. In a place where power, politics, and expectation constantly intersect, structure becomes a quiet necessity, and even something as ordinary as a meal becomes a carefully balanced performance of time, presence, and understanding. Repeated so often that it begins to feel natural to everyone who lives within it. When you spend enough time inside the palace, you begin to realize something quietly unsettling: this role you inhabit. This careful act of tasting before a ruler eats is not unique to one kingdom, it is not tied to one culture, or one moment in time. It appears, again and again, across different civilizations. Shaped by local customs, but always carrying the same underlying idea, the fear of uncertainty at the royal table, you begin to see it like a pattern stretching across history. In some places, the palace kitchens are vast and highly structured, with layers of officials overseeing every stage of preparation. In others, the system is simpler, yet still deeply cautious. Different languages, different tools, different traditions, but a familiar principle beneath them all. In the distant courts of early empires, food safety was not understood the way it is today. There were no scientific explanations for illness that followed a meal. So people relied on observation, habit, and trust, and where trust felt fragile, systems of testing quietly appeared. In some traditions, servants would sample dishes before they reached the ruler. In others, animals were used in indirect ways, as a crude form of reassurance. And in more structured courts, specific individuals were assigned permanently to the task of tasting, their entire identity tied to that responsibility. As you imagine these distant courts, you start to notice how similar the emotional foundation always is. Power creates distance, distance creates uncertainty, and uncertainty demands protection. Even if the methods differ, the intention remains constant. To reduce the invisible risk that surrounds every meal, in certain European courts, history describes highly formal dining systems where meals were not only consumed but ceremonially verified. Food passed through multiple stages of preparation, each overseen by different roles, ensuring that no single point of failure could exist. In parts of Asia, royal kitchens developed their own intricate traditions, often blending culinary artistry with strict protocols of service. Meals were not just nourishment, but expressions of harmony and order, where preparation itself carried symbolic meaning. Elsewhere, in ancient Mediterranean cultures, banquets were as much political theater as they were social gatherings. Who ate what, and when, could signal alliances, loyalty, or distance between powerful figures. Across all these regions, one idea quietly repeats itself: food is never only food in a royal setting, it is trust made visible, or mistrust carefully managed. Back in your own experience within the palace, you begin to see how this role has shifted over time even within a single lineage. What may have once been informal observation gradually becomes structured duty. What may have once been based on personal trust becomes institutional responsibility, and what may have once been a rare precaution becomes a normalized part of court life. You imagine earlier generations of food tasters. If they existed in simpler forms, perhaps they were not even called that. Perhaps they were simply trusted servants who happened to eat first. Over time, as courts became more complex, their role would have solidified, becoming more defined, more cautious, more essential, not because danger increased, but because systems tend to grow around the fears they are meant to manage. One afternoon, you find yourself speaking with a visiting scholar who studies ancient governance. He speaks carefully, choosing his words as if balancing several ideas at once. He explains that many royal customs evolve not from single decisions, but from accumulated habit. A precaution becomes tradition, a tradition becomes expectation, an expectation becomes structure. You listen quietly, realizing how easily something as simple as tasting food could become part of a larger political architecture, not just a personal duty, but a symbol of how authority organizes uncertainty. As the conversation ends, the scholar looks toward the palace kitchens in the distance. He says something that stays with you. Every civilization finds its own way to answer the same question. He says gently, how do you protect what you cannot fully control? Later, as you walk through the palace corridors, that question lingers, because the answer, you realize, is never complete. It only changes form. In some eras, it becomes ritual. In others, it becomes system. In your own time, it becomes a quiet, daily responsibility shared among many hands. And across all civilizations, through all variations, the underlying truth remains unchanged. The closer something is to power, the more carefully it is protected from uncertainty. Even something as ordinary as a meal becomes part of that long, unfolding effort to make the unpredictable just a little more bearable. There is a quiet moment in history when things begin to change. Without anyone truly noticing at first, no announcement, no clear ending, just a slow shift in how the world understands itself. The role of the royal food taster begins to fade in exactly this way, not suddenly, but gradually, like a shadow retreating from a wall as the light behind it changes. Inside the palace, the work continues as always. Meals are still prepared with care, dishes still arrive at the royal table in perfect order. And caution still exists in every step of the process. But something fundamental has started to evolve beneath the surface. Trust, once fragile and uncertain, begins to take a different shape. Not because fear disappears, but because knowledge grows. Over time, people begin to understand more about illness, more about ingredients, more about how food interacts with the human body. What was once mysterious becomes explainable in ways earlier generations could not have imagined, and as understanding expands, the need for certain protective roles slowly begins to feel less absolute. At the same time, the structure of courts themselves begins to shift. Royal households become more organized, more formalized, more reliant on standardized processes rather than individual roles tied to personal risk. Where once a single person might stand between uncertainty and consequence, now systems of preparation, inspection, and accountability begin to distribute that responsibility more widely. It is not that the concern disappears, it is that it becomes managed differently, more broadly, less personally. You start to notice how this affects daily life inside the palace. The presence of a dedicated food taster, once considered essential, becomes less central to the identity of the kitchen. Other roles begin to absorb parts of that responsibility. Chefs develop stricter habits, stewards enforce more consistent checks, servants follow more precise routines than before. What was once concentrated in one figure becomes shared across many hands. And in that sharing, the role itself begins to lose its sharp edge. There are also political changes beyond the palace walls. As societies evolve, power becomes less dependent on direct proximity, communication improves, trade expands, institutions grow more complex. And with that complexity comes new ways of managing risk that do not rely on individual sacrifice in the same way. The world does not eliminate uncertainty, but it learns to spread it differently. One afternoon, you walk through a quieter section of the palace where older servants still speak of earlier times, not with nostalgia exactly, but with recognition that things were once shaped differently. An older steward mentions how, in his youth, The food taster was always a visible figure during meals, present, observant, necessary. Now, he says, that presence feels less defined, not because it has vanished completely in all places, but because its importance has shifted. You listen carefully, realizing that you are standing in the middle of that transition, not at the beginning, not at the end, but somewhere in between, where roles are still visible, but no longer central in the way they once were. Later, in the kitchens, you notice how routines have become more distributed, more people involved in checks, more steps built into preparation, less reliance on a single point of assurance. It creates a quieter environment, but also a more structured one. Safety becomes a process rather than a person. As evening falls, the palace feels unchanged on the surface, but beneath that surface, something fundamental has already shifted. The idea that one individual must carry the full weight of uncertainty is slowly dissolving into something broader, more systematic, more shared, and yet, there is a strange sense of absence in that shift, because when a role disappears, even partially, it leaves behind a kind of memory, a reminder that once, safety was not distributed, it was embodied. You stand near a corridor window as night settles over the palace gardens. The air is still, the lights inside glow softly across stone walls, and you realize something quietly important. The decline of this role is not just about progress, it is also about transformation, from visible responsibility to invisible systems, from individual risk to collective structure. And as history continues to move forward, even within the silence of the palace, you understand that what disappears is not always gone. Sometimes it simply becomes harder to see. There is a strange kind of history that does not end. It does not conclude with a clear moment of closure. It simply fades slowly into something quieter than memory. By the time you reach this point in the palace, the world around you feels familiar in a way that is almost unremarkable. The kitchens still glow with steady firelight, the corridors still carry the soft rhythm of footsteps, and the royal table still stands at the center of ceremony and order. But the role you once thought defined your place here now feels different, less like a title, more like a passing shape within a much larger system. You begin to understand that what you have been part of was never only about tasting food. It was about the silent effort of protecting something fragile, not just a ruler, but the idea that order can be maintained in a world that never fully stops changing. As you reflect on the years of routines, inspections, quiet observation, and endless attention to detail, something becomes clearer than it ever was in the moment. The danger was never the only story, the responsibility was. Every meal carried with it a shared awareness among many people, not fear alone, but care in preparation, care in timing, care in the invisible alignment of countless small actions that made royal life appear effortless from the outside. And now, looking back, you begin to see the forgotten truth of it all. The people who stood closest to power were not always remembered for their closeness. They were remembered, if at all, as part of systems or traditions or roles that later dissolved into history. But they were individuals, each with their own thoughts during long hours in the kitchen, each with their own quiet observations as meals were prepared and served, each carrying an awareness that their actions, though small on their own, contributed to something far larger than themselves. One evening, as the palace settles into its usual rhythm, you walk through corridors that feel both familiar and distant. The walls are unchanged, the light is unchanged, but your understanding of them has shifted. You notice things you once passed without thought, the timing of footsteps between rooms, the way servants instinctively adjust their pace when approaching certain halls, the quiet discipline that holds everything together without needing instruction, and you realize something simple but profound. What protected the king was never one person, it was many, working in silence, without recognition, without ceremony, just continuity. As night deepens, you find yourself standing near an open archway overlooking the palace grounds. The air outside is still, the world beyond the walls feels far away, almost unreal in its distance, and for a moment, everything feels suspended between past and present. You think about the role that once felt so defined, the fear that once seemed so central, the responsibility that once felt so sharp. And now, what remains is something softer, an understanding that history is not only shaped by those who are remembered, but also by those who made remembrance possible. The forgotten people who protected kings did not live in stories, they lived in routines, in repetition, in quiet attention to detail that rarely survives in written records. But without them, the stories would not exist at all. As you take one final look at the palace lit softly in the night, you understand that this is where most histories end, not with a moment of triumph or disaster, but with quiet continuation and the realization that behind every symbol of power, there were always countless unseen lives holding it steady, long enough for it to be remembered at all.